than any other genre, the horror genre is brimming with plentiful familiar tropes. In amongst the final girls, the killers who aren't really dead, the long-lost psycho relatives, and many other cliches showcased brilliantly by Wes Craven and his Scream franchise, one other particular horror trope is that many a filmmaker loves nothing more than using a mental asylum as the setting for their respective pictures. Over the decades, audiences have seen numerous great and not so great horror films based in and around an asylum, a psychiatric ward, or a mental health facility. And it's often been a case of the more abandoned and derelict this building is, the better. I'm Jess from What Culture, and here are the 10 most twisted asylum horror movies. Number 10. Grave Encounters. Realistically, Grave Encounters and Grave Encounters 2 could both earn themselves a spot on this list, but for this entry, we're going to give it to the Vicious Brothers' original picture. An abandoned asylum set found footage offering 2011's Grave Encounters centered on paranormal TV presenter Lance Preston and his crew as they explore the eerie Collingwood Psychiatric Hospital for an upcoming episode of their Grave Encounters show. Of course, a night spent in this spooky location brings way more terror and supernatural shenanigans than Preston and co could have hoped for. And the group's endless walking down dead-end corridors eventually results in them becoming patients of Collingwood themselves. For those who got off lightly, they become unhinged, unstable, and deranged. But a particularly gnarly fate is waiting for Lance Preston, with him attacked by demonic nurses and lobotomized. By the time of Grave Encounters 2 a year later, a bunch of fans of the Grave Encounters TV show head to Collingwood Psychiatric Hospital and find the deranged Lance roaming the halls. Considering the found footage subgenre was on its ass by 2011, Grave Encounters, and to a lesser extent its sequel, showed that it was still possible to put together a genuinely good found footage offering. Number 9. Don't Look in the Basement. Don't Look in the Basement, also known as The Forgotten and Death Ward Number 13, is a creepy 1973 picture set in Stevens Sanitarium. Often described as One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest meets The Last House on the Left, even mimicking Last House's marketing campaign of Remember It's Only a Movie, Don't Look in the Basement features a doctor who thinks the best way to cure insanity is to simply let those involved live out their desires. Of course, this approach kind of immediately backfires on the doctor as he ends up with an axe in his back in the very early stages of the movie. At a pretty impressive rate, Don't Look in the Basement starts to kill off nearly all of its asylum staff and a fair few patients. Our central protagonist ends up being Charlotte Beale, a young nurse who finds herself trapped in the sanitarium with only Dr. Masters for sane company. While these two do their best to survive as the inmates take over the asylum, the gut punch for Charlotte is the revelation that Dr. Masters is actually a patient at the hospital, with her having been allowed to become a doctor as part of the previous tactic of letting people live out their fantasies in order to help cure them. Number 8. Cult of Chucky. What makes Cult of Chucky particularly exciting for fans of the Child's Play franchise is that in this particular picture, there are 4 Chucky dolls running wild. 3 of those good guys are causing chaos in the mental asylum that now houses Nika Pierce, while the other Chucky is a decapitated head that resides in the home of Andy Barclay. The reason why we've got multiple friends till the end here is because Charles Lee Ray has managed to place his spirit in these 3 additional dolls, and 3 additional dolls means 3 times the terror. For Nika, having survived the events of Curse of Chucky, she spent the last 4 years in a mental asylum, having been framed by Chucky, obviously, for the murders that happened in that 2013 picture. When good guy dolls get introduced by Dr. Foley to patients as part of a new relaxation technique, that just so happens to coincide with a slew of deaths happening across the facility. By the time Cult wraps up, Chucky has possessed the body of Nika and is out in the wild with his beau Tiffany, and her own doll, while poor Andy Barclay has been left locked up in the nut house. Number 7. The Exorcist 3. While The Exorcist 2: The Heretic was a massive letdown for Exorcist fans, The Exorcist 3 was actually a pretty impressive film, as either a sequel or a standalone. This one was made by William Peter Blatty and is set 17 years after the events of the first movie, and it completely ignores The Exorcist 2. George C. Scott's Lieutenant Kinderman has a slew of sinister, purportedly demonic murders on his hands. With these murders all falling in line with the habits of the infamous Gemini killer, Kinderman has quite the mystery to solve, particularly as the Gemini killer was executed 15 years ago. Upon visiting a psychiatric unit for advice, Kinderman is introduced to an amnesia-suffering patient who was found 15 years ago, and who claims to be the Gemini killer. As it happens, this patient is none other than Father Karras from the first film, a possessed Father Karras whose appearance briefly changes to that of the Gemini killer. It's revealed how, after the events of The Exorcist, Karras had been taken over by the same entity that tormented young Regan McNeil. Pissed off at being exorcised, this demon uses Karras' carcass as a conduit for the spirit of the Gemini killer, with that spirit leaving Karras on a nightly basis to corrupt other patients and hospital staff into committing atrocities. Number 6. The Cabinet of Dr Caligari. Without any sense of hyperbole, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is one of the most influential movies in the history of cinema. Viewed as one of the first genuinely great films, Robert Wine's 1920 silent horror offering has protagonist Francis investigating a batch of murders that he believes are being ordered and masterminded by the titular Dr. Caligari. Caligari is depicted as the head of a traveling fair, with Francis believing the doctor is somehow having somnambulist Cesare unknowingly carry out the aforementioned killings. In the first big twist in the tale, Francis discovers that Caligari is actually the director of an insane asylum. With the police soon on the scene and Dr. Caligari tied up in a straitjacket, the bigger twist here is that it turns out Francis has imagined the whole thing. In reality, Francis is actually a patient at a mental asylum run by an unnamed director, who is indeed the person previously referred to as Dr. Caligari, with Cesare and the other characters seen in the story all also patients of the not Caligari. Clearly, the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is not as twisted and violent as the asylum-based pictures that followed it, but it's impossible to talk about such films and not make a reference to this absolute classic. Number 5. Bad Dreams. Released in 1988, Andrew Fleming's Bad Dreams sees Cynthia Weston awaken in a psychiatric hospital after spending 13 years in a coma. For Cynthia, she was part of the Unity Fields cult when she was a child. When cult leader Franklin Harris decides that his group needed to embark on a mass suicide via fire, Cynthia is the only person who manages to just about make it out of a torched house alive. Having been plunged into a coma following that trauma, Ruben's character is plagued by nightmarish flashbacks to her time at Unity Fields, with doctors also suspecting Cynthia may have a personality disorder as a result of these horrors. It's not just flashbacks that Cynthia is having now though, for she's also having visions of her fellow patients dying, with these visions soon becoming premonitions when said patients do indeed die in the way Cynthia had seen it. Adding further to her mental strain, it seems that cult leader Franklin is back from the dead and is trying to goad Cynthia into taking her own life. With dreams within dreams, nightmares within nightmares to be more precise, Bad Dreams rockets to a conclusion involving corrupt doctors and mental manipulation. Number 4. Shutter Island. Walking the line between horror and thriller, Martin Scorsese's Shutter Island has one of the greatest twists in modern cinema. As Teddy Daniels, Leonardo DiCaprio plays a US Marshal tasked with investigating a psychiatric facility on the titular island. Joined by his partner Chuck, played by Mark Ruffalo, Teddy is searching for Rachel Solando, a missing patient who drowned her 3 children. What unravels is a tale of underhand experiments, doom-proclaiming patients, a tinge of the supernatural, and a mystery that positions all of Shutter Island's key personnel as having something to do with her disappearance and subsequent reappearance. Of course, the big swerve of Shutter Island is that Teddy Daniels isn't a real person. Instead, Teddy is actually Andrew Laidus and is the most dangerous patient in the asylum. After his mentally ill wife Dolores drowned their 3 children, Laidus murdered her and was thus incarcerated. As is explained, Edward Daniels and Rachel Solando are anagrams of Andrew Laidus and Dolores Chanel. The whole Teddy Daniels persona was created by Laidus to hide the guilt he feels at not seeking help for his wife prior to her killing their children. The events of Shutter Island were merely a desperate attempt to cure Andrew's insanity, with the facility's staff playing along in one last attempt to stop Laidus from being lobotomized. Number 3. A Nightmare on Elm Street 3. Dream Warriors. Is A Nightmare on Elm Street 3 Dream Warriors the best in the franchise? Possibly. Does it have the best soundtrack in the franchise? Absolutely. Not only is Elm Street 3 in the conversation as the best movie in the franchise, it also nicely dovetails the end of Nancy Thompson into the rising up of a new set of protagonists. Having been targeted by Freddy Krueger in the original picture, Heather Langenkamp's Nancy returns here as an intern therapist at Western Hills Psychiatric Hospital. Here, Nancy encounters a group of youngsters who've been placed under the care of Western Hills, and who are soon having their own battles with Robert Englund's Freddy. Dream Warriors is particularly a shocker upon a first watch, as very few believe Nancy would actually be killed off by Krueger. Also, Langenkamp's character does indeed bite the bullet, although she goes out with a bang as she takes Freddy with her. Full of brilliantly imaginative kills, A Nightmare on Elm Street 3 featured what made the first film work so well, while adding some great new characters, some of which managed to survive and lead the charge for A Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master. It's just a shame that The Dream Master took so much of what made Dream Warriors great and discarded it. Number 2, The Ward. As it stands, The Ward is the final film to be directed by the legendary John Carpenter. Sure, this 2010 picture may not be of the same quality as, say, Halloween, The Fog, or The Thing, but The Ward is a movie that's deserving of way more praise than it often gets. Set in 1966, the film finds Amber Heard's troubled Kristen locked up in Coos-based psychiatric hospital after setting fire to a farmhouse. At Coos, Kristen meets the childlike Zoe, intense Emily, artsy Iris, sultry Sarah, and hears all about a previous patient named Tammy. With no memory of her past and having been attacked by a deformed creature, poor Kristen is drugged and given a hearty dose of electroshock treatment by Jared Harris's Dr. Stringer. Once Iris is killed by former patient Alice Hudson, Kristen starts to dig deep on the mystery behind Alice and discovers that this ex-patient was a bully who the other girls grouped together to kill. Now, the spirit of Alice is stalking those at the psychiatric hospital to exact revenge. Sarah, Emily, and Zoe soon end up dead, and the ward comes down to Alice versus Kristen. The kicker here, of course, is that it's revealed Kristen is Alice Hudson. Having been kidnapped at 11 years of age, Alice spent 2 months chained up in the basement of the farmhouse burnt down in the opening scene. In order to survive this trauma, she developed a personality disorder that manifested itself in the shape of Kristen, Zoe, Emily, Iris, and Sarah. Number 1, The Dead Pit. While some of the movies featured here are these delicate slow burns you really have to get into, The Dead Pit is pretty much just nuts from the get-go. In fact, The Dead Pit is the most insane movie on this list, and this is a list that features Freddy Krueger's head coming out of a TV set. Playing like a slasher movie set within an insane asylum, this 1989 picture starts by introducing us to the genius but bonkers Dr. Ramsey. Putting his patients through brutal tests and experiments as part of his quest to master death, Ramsey ends up dead and buried in the basement of the mental facility where he carried out his work. From there, we travel 20 years down the line, where the amnesia-suffering Jane Doe is admitted to the asylum. After an earthquake rocks the building, our Jane starts to see creepy patients emerge from the bowels of the building. But as is ever the case, nobody particularly believes her. Once we get the revelation that Jane and her mother had changed their names years prior to escape her deranged father, it's no major surprise to see the totally not dead Dr. Ramsey resurface and reveal himself to be the father in question. Oh, and Dr. Ramsey has an army of undead experimented on zombies under his charge by this point, so there's that too.